Okay, class, we're going to talk about one more of our readings for this semester. Kind of the first half of our Unit 6, which is split between Apollinaire and Rilke. Guillaume Apollinaire, right? I'm sure if you looked him up, which you should have done, you'll notice that everything explains that he has excuse me, a different name, which is his birth name, that I will not remotely attempt to butcher with pronunciation, right? Polish Belarusian descent, right? Um, that reality of like taking on a French name and like existing in a French space kind of comes to define most of Apollinaire's life, right? There is a constant struggle, which happens to plenty of people in different cultures, but in a specific way is very quintessentially French, right? Which is France's difficulty in accepting those who are not born francophone, right, born in France to the French as being French, right? It extends all the way to modern politics, right? Like France will take in all sorts of refugees, but their argument is that when you come here, you're not, in the very kind of American melting pot sense, you're not like Mexican American, so you wouldn't be, Moroccan French. No, no, no. If you come to our country, you just become French, right? Which has its own complications, let's say, which you often see play out on the news when France pops up, right? This went way back, right? And early 20th century, it had a different tenor and was as much, if not more, intense, even against other Europeans, right? So there was this struggle of not being French enough, right, which kind of plagued Apollinaire for most of his life, that he had to kind of constantly deal with, right? He wrote everything, okay? Novels, short stories, poems, plays, and art criticism. The last one's particularly interesting because of where and when he is showing up. He's early 20th century, pre-World War One, in France, in Paris, right? And this means that he is in some of the most recognizable artistic company that we can consider, right? So you can find the lists of people that he, collaborates with, right, and the movements that he is tied to, and we'll touch on a couple of them here. So he essentially coined, cubism, orphism, and surrealism as like terms to describe or the definitions therein. And essentially was like the forefather of the realist poets, the surrealist poets, excuse me, right? Um, uh, Meets Picasso in like 1904, who's probably the most famous of all of his friends and collaborators. They get along super well, right? And then in this desire to be French enough, he starts drawing desperately off of French tradition, okay? So some of the people he worked with that you'll probably recognize the names of: Picasso, Rousseau, Gertrude Stein, Andre Salmon, which you read the poem for the wedding of, right? Marc Chagall, Marcel Duchamp, and on and on and on and on. There's so many, right, that aren't even, people that come after, that are contemporaries to him, that he's working around and with. Paris was wild in the early 20th century in an artistic sense, right? Um, so his influences coming out of the 19th century, right, are the symbolists, right? So symbolists, we haven't talked a lot about movements because we've been moving around globally, so they don't all line up, right? But symbolists is like a Western European artistic movement. We're very concerned as like making their work about a symbol. We have a thing that stands for something else. We're going to focus a lot on that, right? So he does a little bit of that, right? But we move into Orphism, which is, excuse me, like we already had the symbol to represent the abstract. Like, what if we kind of take out the middleman and we stop making art about like a portrait of a thing, and we start to get really abstract, right? He kind of described it as like pure art, that it like only comes from inside the artist, right? Very aesthetically concerned and stuff like that, right? You'll see plenty of movements delve into these ideas later on, right? I'm sure plenty of you guys started to think of like modern art and stuff like that, sort of, right? An art history major would be better equipped to kind of unpack the full artistic implications of this, right? Moves on into surrealism, where it's not as buckwild and it is still tied to the somewhat real, but it is like a heightened realism, right? And so where things are like 110% of reality, right? Very intense and energized and imaginative, but still has some recognizable parts of the real of the human inside them. Okay. Given how many people of incredible political import he was around, right? He was politically involved, dabbled in all sorts of stuff, anarchism, and the like, kind of being most notable. World War One came around, and like so many, he went to serve and was grievously injured. Right, shrapnel wound to the head, which he didn't ever really recovered from. It was about 3 years, something like that. 3 years, 3 months, something like that. After that, he finally succumbed to influenza during the Spanish flu pandemic. Right, so. And died. And he was recognized very grateful, for his service at the time, right? And is interred in France, right? The reason I brought Apollinaire to us is because there are interesting discussions to be had about, in the translation of this, we have the benefit of him being in the time period that he's in, right? Early 20th century. We've looked at a lot of 20th century stuff. The more recent is, the easier it is in some senses to translate just on a pure linguistic level. But potentially the more complicated it gets on a political / agenda based level, right? But we have, it's in French, obviously an incredibly documented language in the West, right? And it lets us kind of unpack poetry in a foreign language that is being translated, but it was also written in a style that is supposed to be somewhat abstract. So we have to kind of grapple with the realities of like how it's written and what it's doing, right? Which I think when we look back at Hikmet also would bring up, right? There's a lot of complexity there, right? That are particularly interesting, right? There is poem at the marriage of André Salmon, right? Super famous, right? I will not break down the reading for you, right? It's nostalgic and interesting in a neat way. I will just put it to you this way: for a wedding, right, and a wedding toast poem, isn't it a little weird that he doesn't really talk about the wife? Like, we're at a wedding. I'm just going to tell everyone how great Andre is. Hell yeah, Andre. We're best friends. We do everything together. You're getting married, and that's great. But us, we go way back, Andre. And it's like, you think there would be more of a just, like, celebration of the actual union that Andre is there for, right? Like, his wife is there when this poem is being read. And don't worry, Apollinaire doesn't have really much to say about her, which I just always found really hilarious after the first time it was pointed out to me. It's like, wow, this like grand like literary gestures being done, and the guy is kind of an asshole as he's doing it, right? So interesting, right? The other one that one of the other ones I had you look at, aside from Zone, right? So Zone is interesting because it deals a lot with that thing we talked about, where he's so concerned with being French enough, right? He's drawing out of francophone conditions, of francophone being French, right? Of the French culture, right? So he's so distinctly francophone. He pulls from the imagery and the gestures and the language and the history, and he steeps himself in it. The streets of Paris, he's definitely kind of that same era. He's writing at the same time as Dulce Maria. He just dies a lot younger, right? And it's just very kind of indicative of who he was and what he was doing, right? And then you have Cœur Mirror, the heart poem, right? And I I really, really think it's interesting to show because we have to translate something and then still shape it, right? So we've already talked about going back to like Basho, right, where we have these kind of limitations of what a form can look like in a different language, and now we have a form that's all about in a physical poem, which is what we would call those, where it's shaped to look like some part of the poem. It's all about the shape. Like, it needs to look like a heart, right? So when you translate it, you have to translate it, but not in a way that's like unwieldy or too short or too long that you break the shape. Like, it has to look like the same artifact, just now in English. So that had to be super interesting to translate, right? You have kind of like an extra asterisk of like, I gotta make sure to say this in the like way that's only takes like 3 words instead of 6 words, because we gotta get all the way around, you know, the upper right curve of the heart here, so that it all connects and it's not a different looking heart than Apollinaire's heart, right? Really, really, really fun, right? And I wanted to bring it up because I think it's another good gesture of how different the poetry can look, right? So I was excited to let you guys get a look at it, okay? With that being said, though, right, Apollinaire and this unit and the Rilke unit are specifically supposed to be a little shorter because you have a bunch of other work to do, right? And you have the Thanksgiving holiday, right? So I hope you are all taking great care of yourselves. And then the next video will be about Rilke.